busy day, busy week, but nothing too big. Just for argument stuff.
We have 2 more weeks to go. Next week, in the next to the last class, I want to return to the social, theoretical, and philosophical foundations of the argument, of the programmatic argument in the course. On the one side, the idea of the self and the view of the human condition, and on the other side, the theory of regimes, of structure and structural change and structural alternatives. These are the 2 great pillars of a programmatic argument such as this one. And then in the last class, 2 weeks from today, I don't intend to make any presentation whatsoever. That class will be reserved for a completely open discussion. And I hope that you will conversation about the central themes of the course and the themes that emerge from your writing projects for the final paper. So I hope that each of you will come equipped with questions and ideas for us to discuss in that final class. Well, today again, then we turn to the theme of globalization. The arguments of the course have been arguments about alternatives, structural alternatives in national settings. The main setting of politics and of transformation remains the sovereign state, the nation state. That may not be true forever in all phases of future human history, but it is certainly true today. And just as a central theme in the programmatic arguments of the course has been that the market order has no single natural and necessary form, and neither does democracy, and that the most important transformations are transformations of the economic and the political order, so too the question that we confront today is best phrased not as the question of whether we want more or less globalization, but rather which globalization. There are alternative versions of globalization, just as there are alternative versions of the market and of democracy. Now, the world remains committed to the idea that the nation state should continue for the foreseeable future to be the main setting in which alternatives are pursued. And we should try to understand the basis for this preference that the world has. So there's the idea that society has no natural form, and that humanity develops its powers and possibilities only by developing them in different directions. And those different directions then are pursued in the setting of the sovereign states of the world under the shield of these armed states. And there's an additional reason that we could add, which is that to the extent that the aim is to overthrow the dictatorship of no alternatives in the world, that dictatorship is much easier to overthrow, or in fact can only be overthrown in the setting of the nation states. If we were to imagine a world state, a world empire, in all probability, whatever regime it established would then be much harder to overturn. Now, of course, this commitment of the world to the sovereign state comes with a heavy danger. And the danger is the danger of war among the states, and especially war among the great powers. Of course, even if there were a world state or a world empire, history suggests that that state or that empire might break up into clashing parts, and war might occur nevertheless. However, it seems reasonable to suppose that the danger of world war would be less great if there were a world state than it is now, with a world of sovereign states, each of them armed, and some of them armed to the teeth. So nevertheless, even in those conditions, it seems that the preference of humanity is to side with the sovereign state and to regard the suppression of national difference by the sovereign states as a greater evil. This choice is not self-evident, but I have to say that in this clash of views, I side with humanity against the globalists. The literature about globalization and about international relations is penetrated by what you might describe as a soft globalism. The implicit bias of those who write on this topic is weakening of the national state in favor of acquisition of many of its powers by an emergent world order. Now, before going any further, I'd like to stop and ask whether someone would like to comment on this argument that I have just sketched between the defense of the sovereign state and globalism. I'm taking as the premise of what I have to say later on in today's class that the world wants indeed a world order of some kind, and in that sense, global governance, but it wants global governments without a world state. And that's the thesis that I acknowledge at the outset is not self-evidently preferable, but seems to be overwhelmingly the preference of humanity, although not the preference of those who write about this topic. Would anyone like to comment on this early on in the discussion? We can come back to it, of course, in the course of the hour, in the course of the class. Yes.
I question to what extent a world state model impacts self-determination and the ability of people to, in a meaningful way, make decisions that affect their own lives on a localized level.
So what are you saying? Are you saying there could be a world state, but without prejudice to individual or small group self-determination? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying I'm skeptical of a world state for that reason.
You're skeptical?
Yeah, skeptical of a world state because I fear that...
Well, I share your skepticism, and I'm claiming now that the vast majority of humanity shares it as well. So I'm certainly not going to speak for the world state. So I was hoping by asking for this question whether someone would speak for it, and someone would...
Not me, sorry.
Okay. So again, the central premise, the central assumption is that there's no natural way, no natural form of human life, that our human potential can be translated into different forms of life. The state, through the law, enacts defines the institutional arrangements that give shape to social life, and there should be a dialectic. There should be a concert of different forms of life in the world, and that, according to this predominant view, is how we develop our potential. That seems to be the most significant basis of this idea. But as I just said, it comes attached with a price. And the price is the danger of conflict among the armed states of the world. So in relation to the point you just made, the sovereign state raises a shield. Behind these shields, we develop distinctive forms of life that shape or fail to shape forms of collective and individual self-determination. We could consider what's at stake if we take the often stated belief that the European Union is a model for globalization. And the European Union has developed, as I remarked in an earlier class, on the principle that the decisions about the basic forms of social and political life are centralized, and then the endowments of the citizens, their social rights and their educational opportunities, are devolved to the national and subnational authorities. That's the main architectural principle in the organization of the Union. And when people say that the Union is a model for globalization, they seem to mean that this same idea should be extended to the whole world. In other words, there should be a central authority. The central authority should determine the basic forms of organization, and then the endowment should be devolved to the national and subnational authorities. And I said in an earlier class that that helps account for the hostility to the Union of all the most vital social and intellectual forces in Europe, the right, the left, the young, the old. Whoever is against the established order on the whole is against the Union. Now, if we imagine the Union as a model for the whole of globalization, then that opposition would be extended to the whole world. Yes?
This might be out of scope, but if part of your premise was that the world indeed wants a world order of some kind, I'm curious if you think anarchy or anarchists and even libertarians have any role to play, or that their ideas are valid of any kind, or do we assume and take for granted the fact that the world wants?
Well, depending on what the theory of anarchy is, the theory of anarchy is certainly opposed to an order imposed from on top. But it's not necessarily imposed to an order. The question is, what kind of an order? So in principle, anarchy, on some versions, is compatible with the idea of a spontaneous order, or an order constructed from the bottom up. And that is indeed the corollary of this preferred thesis of humanity. It wants some kind of order because, and why does it want some kind of an order? Because there are global public goods to achieve that cannot be achieved simply by the sovereign states acting within their own frontiers. So they would have to be achieved through cooperative action. And what is even more significant is that there are global public harms that have to be averted, of which the most important is armed conflict, especially armed conflict among the great powers, and then, of course, destructive climate change, and a long list of other subjects, such as human trafficking, for example, that are harms that are international harms and require international solutions. So then those who are opposed to a world state nevertheless want some kind of order, although not an order imposed from the top down, that would be capable of delivering these global public goods and averting those global public harms. Now, one way in which we think about international order, and it is a vocabulary peculiarly associated with the United States and with American diplomacy, is the vocabulary of the rule-based international order. So the idea is there is a rule-based international order, and this rule-based international order, if you look at this concept more closely, turns out to have two distinct components. So one component are the international organizations, especially now the international organizations established in the aftermath of the Second World War, the United Nations systems and the Bretton Woods organizations, especially the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the second component of the idea of the rule-based international order is public international common law, which of course long preceded these arrangements established after the Second World War. Now, what is the relation between these two components? How should we understand them? The public international law is, as it were, the crystallized residue, the legacy of some active formation of new arrangements. You could call it proto-law. And this proto-law then would come under this idea of the rule-based international order from the work of the international organizations. That is, the world would deal with its problems, its global problems. It would seek to achieve these global public goods and to avert the global public harms through its activity in the international organizations. Now, here's the problem, stated very briefly. The problem is that, on the whole, these global organizations either don't work at all, or they work in a way that is completely different from what was anticipated and desired. So take the United Nations. The United Nations has two main bodies, the General Assembly and the Security Council. And neither of them works. So the General Assembly is a kind of debating club that has among its members dozens of mini-states or pseudo-states that have no real political reality, and then the great powers of the world. So it can't be taken seriously as a venue for the resolution of the major problems of humanity. On the other hand, the Security Council is much more selective, and the Security Council gives the right of veto to the 5 victors or putative victors of a war that ended 80 years ago. And it no longer reflects the real correlation of forces in the world. So the United States and its allies, when they feel threatened in a vital security interest, go to the Security Council and try to achieve some kind of redress. And when they achieve redress from the Security Council, exceptionally, they then fill up the balloon with air, and they give prestige and authority to the Security Council. If the Security Council, by virtue of the Chinese and Russian vetoes, denies them what they want, they go outside the Security Council and get what they want anyway by organizing a so-called coalition of the willing. So then they empty the balloon of air. And that's the only security system, global security system, that the world has. And of course it doesn't work, it's a wreck. So what's the significance of this for the conception of the international rule-based public order? The significance is that the pipeline, as it were, which is this proto-law, which is supposed to be produced by the international organizations, doesn't work. And therefore, public international common law, which would be the crystallized residue of this proto-law, is starved of what would be the basis of new law. So that's the situation. So the breakdown or the failure of the multilateral organizations then results in the evisceration, the starving, as I called it, of public international common law. Now, nevertheless, to go back to the case of the United Nations, it's not to say that the United Nations altogether fails, because there's at least one respect in which the United Nations does work. It has worked as an umbrella organization for voluntary cooperation among states. And that has been particularly manifest in the Conference of the Parties meetings about catastrophic climate change, which resulted in the Paris Agreement of 2016 and the Glasgow Agreements of 2021. So that's the completely unanticipated, surprising way in which the United Nations has worked. Now, let's take that fact as the inspiration for a way to think about the problem of the construction of a global order from below, from the bottom up. So, as I say, the globalists, the soft globalists, who dominate in the literature of global governance, can all have schemes for the salvation of humanity through different forms of global public order. And no one pays any attention to this, because almost all of these schemes imply some radical curtailment of national sovereignty, which the sovereign states and the majority of humanity itself seem not to want. So what does work? Now, when we turn from the encyclopedic constructivism of the globalists, which are full of proposals, fantastical proposals, like in the 18th century, like the French encyclopedists writing a constitution for Poland or a constitution for Corsica. They could write anything they wanted on the piece of paper, right? But when we turn from those fantasies to the reality of what does work, what does work is voluntary cooperation among the sovereign states of the world. So in practice, there is only one thing that has worked, although there are these dozens of constructivist proposals of fantasies. What has worked are what you could call appropriating the American vocabulary of the coalitions of the willing, coalitions of states. And these coalitions of states have had three forms. So first, there are single-purpose organizations, which are cooperative initiatives of the sovereign states to solve some particular problem which they cannot effectively solve within their national borders. For example, there's the problem of human trafficking, and then there are organizations that deal with this problem, or the problem of the development of our ability to exploit solar energy. And that results then in the formation of these single-purpose organizations. The second type of coalition of the willing are regional coalitions, such as the European Union or the African Union, in which a particular region of the world organizes itself, and sometimes, as in the case of the European Union, this organization of a region of the world is proposed as a model for globalization as a whole. And finally, there's a third category of what you could call similar state coalitions of the willing. That is, states that are similar because they're comparable in their level of development, or because they exercise a similar function within the state system. And of those, the three main examples now are the G7, the G20, and the BRICS. The BRICS bringing together China, India, Russia, Brazil, and now South Africa. And you might imagine possibly a fourth type of coalition of the willing, an informal type, which would be an entente or an association of states, especially of the middle-level powers, to try and diminish the dangers of world war, of clash between what are now the two great powers of the United States and China. And the model for this entente of the lesser powers would be, on one side, the so-called Concert of Europe in the 19th century, under the guidance of Bismarck, and its earlier form under the guidance of Metternich. And then on the other side, the League of Nations, which had a much narrower objective than the United Nations system, which was specifically designed to ensure the territorial integrity and therefore the sovereignty of the sovereign states. It's often said that the League of Nations came to grief on the absence of American support. Woodrow Wilson famously failed to win the acquiescence of the Senate to the project of the League of Nations, and because it lacked an instrument of armed power. But it also had another problem, which is more intangible, which is its premature formalization. It became involved in a whole apparatus, a rigmarole of codicils and treaties and councils, and did not have the flexibility that Bismarck desired to impart to the Council of Europe, of operating in a middle zone between law grounded in ideology and war. The objective was a flexible arrangement among the leading powers of the day that would prevent any power from having to choose between war and surrender. and that was then capable of generating, little by little, step by step, in fragments, what I just call proto-law. Now, the problem now is that there are these two hegemonic powers, the United States and China. And each of them, for different reasons, is not in effective moral communion with humanity. But they exemplify very different situations. So China is a developmental dictatorship of some kind. And it is unique in modern history because there has never been in modern history a great power so bereft of allies and friends as China. China stands alone. It has no real allies. One could say its allies are Pakistan, North Korea, a friendless friend if ever there was one, Pakistan, an ally who would rather not be one, and Cambodia, a hapless client state. Those are the allies of China. So China is alone. And it then tries to overcome this isolation through commercial initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, which only inflame and enrage the supposed victims of its commercial beneficence. So that's China. And China is also a revisionist power. It's a power that apparently wants to revise the international arrangements established after the Second World War. But it is a revisionist power without a revisionist program. It has no explicit or patent program for the revision of the international arrangements established after the Second World War. So take a small example, which is the redesign of the Security Council so that the veto power would not be solely vested in these countries which were grandfathered in at the end of the Second World War, and which include the United States and two of its military allies, the United Kingdom and France. China is the most vociferous opponent to any withdrawing of the Security Council because it wants to avoid the inclusion in the Security Council of two friends of the United States, India and Japan. And so it has no revisionist program. And this failure of revisionist program is associated with the absence of a national debate inside China about China's development and China's future in the world, and its lack of allies and friends, of engagement with the world. Now take the United States. The United States is full of allies and friends, including military allies, and much of the world stands under its spell. And now let me begin by trying to define the salvageable residue in the otherwise mystical idea of American exceptionalism. So the idea of American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is different from all the other countries in the world. It's a unique case. And it sees itself as the model, as holding the formula. So it believes that early in the history of its republic, it discovered the definitive formula of a free society, of the market and of democracy, and the rest of humanity should either subscribe to that formula or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. But it's at the extreme of a spectrum of characteristics of the rich North Atlantic democracies. So it is the most unequal society among all of them, among these rich North Atlantic industrial democracies, with the most pronounced and rigid class structure and the greatest restraints on social mobility. At the same time, it is among all of them the least disposed to recognize its own class character, its own inequalities. It is by far the most religious of them. And amidst these vast inequalities and exclusions, it remains among all of them the one in which ordinary men and women are most likely to think, surprisingly, that everything is possible. There's the religion of the new in the United States. So the United States is indeed exceptional, but not exceptional in the sense that it's unlike all the other ones, exceptional in the sense that it stands at the extreme of the spectrum of the North Atlantic democracies. And its foreign policy, from long before its emergence on the world scene as a major power, has been based on two principles from which the American statesmen have never deviated. The first principle is that the United States must work to prevent any other power in any other region of the world from consolidating in that region a hegemony so uncontested that on that basis of regional hegemony, it can then bid for world hegemony. That's the first principle of American foreign policy. And the second principle of American foreign policy is that in the Western Hemisphere, the United States will insist on an undisputed hegemony. So the second principle is in manifest contradiction to the first, but it is equally one of the invariant presuppositions of American foreign policy. It was enacted early on by the Monroe Doctrine, very early in the history of the United States, and then by the Roosevelt Corollary, a reference to Theodore Roosevelt, at the end of the 19th century. And so this shape of American foreign policy in turn describes the difficulty that the United States has with its engagement in humanity. So here we have these two hegemonic powers. And for opposite reasons, or for different or even opposite reasons, and each in its own way, each of them has trouble engaging with the rest of the world. So we could describe them as two awkward and solipsistic Gullivers. And what should the world then do with these awkward and solipsistic Gullivers? It should do with them what the Lilliputians did with the original Gulliver. It should tie them down with strings. And the strings would be these coalitions of the willing. That is, the multiplication of forms of cooperative action in which the rest of the world, especially the intermediate powers, should seek to engage the two hegemonic powers, but in such a way that they will feel less restrained than empowered by these engagements, by these cooperative engagements, and gradually create a situation in which the vinegar of reciprocal belligerence is more likely to be turned back into the wine of peaceful and productive competition. That's what the world would desire. And it would require then the development of a fourth type of coalition of the willing alongside those three other types to engage these great powers and make armed clash between them less likely. Now finally, let me return to a theme from earlier in the course in which to describe the relation between these ideas about global governance without world government and the change in the character of the nation state. So remember the claim from earlier on in the argument of the course. The nations of the world, most of them used to be like tribes, based on consanguinity and similarity, on social and cultural homogeneity. And increasingly, the nations in the world are becoming something other than tribes. They, at the extreme of this direction in which they're going, is a kind of moral specialization within humanity. There's different ways of being human under the shield of these armed and sovereign states. And then I said, in that process, in that journey from being tribes to being this other thing, forms of moral specialization, an accident happens. The accident being the evisceration of the concrete, customary collective identities. So to be a nation meant to live according to the ancient customs of your tribe, of your people. But now in this process of worldwide competition and emulation, in which the nations try to outdo each other in economic prosperity, military power, and cultural attraction, they have to come to the altar of this worldwide competition and tear out part of themselves. So they have to abandon some of their customs, which define their tangible, porous identity, and import from outside what seems to work. The result is that the porous, tangible collective identities are increasingly hollowed out from within. They're eviscerated. But as the actual differences among the nations wane, their desire for national difference is inflamed. So the more similar they become, the more intense their desire to affirm their difference under the shield of the sovereign states. And that, I said, was the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. That the two nations are side by side and they hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike and because they want to be different. Then there are two conventional responses to this circumstance. One is the response of regressive nationalism, which says, restore the ancient ways, the ancient differences. The other is the response of liberal cosmopolitanism, which says, suppress difference in favor of convergence to the same best practices and institutions. And then the differences would be just cultural differences without institutional expression. It would be a kind of folklore floating over the reality of institutional convergence. Those are the two conventional views. And the alternative that I argued for earlier was equip difference. So replace this abstract will to difference by the political and economic institutions that would allow the nations of the world to create new difference. And on this view then, difference is not the problem. Difference is the solution. But difference has to be equipped by institutional arrangements that can create it. The real differences, unlike the abstract will to difference, are tangible, and because they're tangible, they're porous and susceptible to compromise. Whereas the abstract will to difference can only be the object of an intransigent faith. So that's part of the situation, and it's against that background of this perversion, this detour in the nature of the nations, that this cooperative activity of the sovereign states would have to take place. So the system that I've just outlined is in some sense a revival, a reinterpretation of the earliest system that was proposed in Western political theory and Western law, the system of Grotius in the 17th century. Because Grotius had in his idea 4 main elements. One was the affirmation of the Westphalian principle of the primacy of sovereign states, which I'm accepting here with the qualifications that I suggested. The second was the idea of the law of treaties as the contractual element in international life. And I'm supposing that the ongoing relational contracts, the unfinished bargains, the incomplete deals created by these coalitions of the willing, the regional, the similar state coalitions, and the single purpose coalitions would then be the agents for this contractual element in international life. The third element in Grotius' system was the pre- and post-contractual element of public common international law, which would continue to be necessary in any future. But as I said before, it's now, the pipeline is cut off, it's starved of content, and the content has to come from this proliferation of cooperative activity among the sovereign states of the world. And then the fourth element was his ideal, which was a natural law ideal of natural right. And there's a counterpart to it now, which is the idea of agency, the enhancement of agency, which is the most powerful ideal in the world. The individual man and woman stands up and exercises agency, develops agency under the shield of the sovereign state. Now, there's a problem, of course, that we can bring under the label of normative conditionality. So, to what extent should respect by the sovereign state for some version of rights guaranteeing agency be a requirement for participation in these coalitions? And the answer is it can't be. At the outset, it normally can't be, except in the regional coalitions like the European Union, when there is already a great deal of convergence among them. And even then there's a problem, like the problem that the European Union is having now with, for example, Hungary or Poland, in the respect for certain human and political rights and forms of democracy. So we can't accept that. We can't say that, for example, in the climate arrangements, the country that most pollutes, China, will not participate. Or we can't say that in the other coalitions, the countries that are armed to the teeth, like China, Russia, and the United States, will not be allowed to participate. So everyone has to participate. If we impose normative conditionality at the outset, then we force the world to choose between regressive nationalism and some universal liberal ideal. The world will choose regressive nationalism. And if we first force the world to choose between accepting the cause of economic and political freedom in the institutional form that it has in the North Atlantic world, or refusing the idea of political and economic freedom in order not to accept that institutional form, it will do the latter rather than the former. So we have to play for time. That's the idea. We have to create, through this cooperative activity in the world, the conditions for little by little, in later stages of human history, imposing constraints of normative conditionality. Yes?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. I'm completely on board with this idea that we can't exclude countries because of their situation or their views or values. But in your chapter, you elevate the notion of human rights, individual human rights as a kind of precondition for acceptance in the
Me?
Yeah.
No, I don't. No, because you have to take this in the context of what I've said before about liberalism and social democracy. So, and let's go back to that so that we can include this critical argument from before. So, first I said that the crucial element in liberal political theory is the distinction between an impersonal, neutral framework of right and sectarian goods. And the first thing I said is that distinction is no good, and we have to reject it. And that is the most fundamental distinction in liberal political theory. There is no neutral framework of right. Every framework of right tilts the scales of human experience in favor of some forms, of some ways of being human against others. But nevertheless, I said and this is a dangerous idea because it does the opposite of what it's claiming to do. That is, what it does by claiming that a certain framework of right is neutral is to immunize it against attack. So in other words, the framework of right is sectarian, always, and by claiming that it's neutral, you entrench it against criticism and attack. But that false idea has a kinship with a legitimate and indispensable idea, which is that the institutional framework should be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and above all, it should be corrigible. That is, we should be able to change it in the light of experience. So contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. That was the first criticism. Then the second criticism is to say the liberal framework of rights is focused on this notion of a haven of safeguards against public and private oppression and of capability ensuring endowments. And it delivers the rest of social life to the forces of oppression, of custom, of habit. So the counterpart to the haven has to be the storm. We have to ensure that social life is rendered plastic at the same time that we withdraw from the agenda of short-term politics the instruments necessary to provide this haven. So I'm supposing a thoroughgoing criticism of the liberal preconceptions. But and that's part of the reason why we have to play for time. We have to play for time not just to prevent the world faced with a choice from making the worst choice, which is what it would now make, in order not to capitulate to the Western arrangements and liberal ideas, it would choose the opposite. But also because we need to develop in the world this larger conversation about the alternatives. And that takes time, and therefore we have to play for time. That's the argument that I'm making. So it's an argument that takes into account the failures, the defects of the established liberal views, for which we have no ready-made alternative. And we've seen that, how difficult it is for us to reshape these ideas and give them alternative institutional forms. Now, any other comment or intervention? Yes?
Yes, sir, I'm curious to understand within the framework of regional coalitions, whether it is Africa Union or European Union, there is an increased voice which is coming in for a federalism within the union. And what are the merits and demerits, and how that would
Well, I've stated my position about this. So I think that the architecture of the European Union is upside down. So the main vocation, if the Union wants to be a model for global governance, not for a world state, but for global governance, it should turn it upside down. That is, the main responsibility of the Union should be to ensure the capabilities and endowments of all of its citizens, their educational endowments and their economic endowments, but then to give them the greatest latitude for institutional experimentation, including experimentation in the forms of the market order. And the countries that would have the clearest interest in this within Europe would be the southern and the Eastern European states, so that they would not be pegged at an unfavorable position in the division of labor within Europe and within the world economy. In other words, they need to innovate in their forms of production and in their forms of economic organization so that they're not condemned to be in the niche of relatively primitive production. So they don't need this kind of regulation in favor of convergence, which the European Union now imposes. So it's a world in which what we would want in the world is more difference and more institutions capable of creating new difference. Not the difference that is remembered, but the difference that is produced in the future. Prophecy is more important than memory, even though prophecy works with the instruments of memory. So we need to organize the world so that this cooperative activity creates the basis for for the production of new difference in the world, new difference of every kind, political, economic, and cultural. And that is the basis on which humanity unifies. It unifies by divergent. Yes?
Hi, I'm trying to understand the initial argument of the dictatorship of no alternatives within the nation state. I'm trying to understand the analogy that you're making in the international order. So you said earlier that the dictatorship can only be overthrown in the setting of the national state.
Yes.
And also, you use...
That, which is not to say that the world order can't give instruments for this, right? The world order, if the world order, by helping to deliver these global public goods that cannot be adequately delivered just by the sovereign states acting in their own frontiers and averting the global public harms, the system of global governments can make it easier for the dictatorship of no alternatives to be overthrown within the states.
Okay. And when you mentioned the coalition of the willing, it's more like a description. It's not like you're not trying to make a normative
No, I am making a normative thing in this sense. What I'm saying is I'm making a very particular claim. I'm saying that if we examine the creation of world order with this attention to realism, it turns out that there's only one thing that works. If you looked at the literature of global governance, it would seem there are millions of possibilities. You know? Each one is pretending to play Lycurgus to the world. They do this, do that. It's not, they're not going to do any of these things. They're going to do what they need to do to achieve these global public goods and avert the global public harms. So what I'm saying is that that's the necessary point of departure. But it becomes normative if you say, that's what's real. So let's seize on that and develop from that, because the other things aren't real. And then we have a whole task. So then we have, as I said, these two hegemonic powers, armed to the teeth. One of them very connected, the other unconnected, but both of them have trouble being in communion with humanity. And they can't save themselves. We have to help engage in this situation by multiplying these connections in this immensely patient and frustrating work of construction of diplomacy. So in this conception that I'm drawing, political and moral realism is the ally of the utopian imagination, right? Because we have an ambitious project, but the project has to begin from what's real, otherwise it's bad utopianism. That's the argument. Yes?
What would human rights and the enforcement of human rights look like in this program you're outlining?
Well, I think as reality has shown, so first of all, over time the conception of rights has to be changed, right? So we have to think of rights as being, as it were, the complement to this other thing, the storm, as I called it. And that's why in the arguments of this semester, the main emphasis has been on arranging the storm. In other words, the storm doesn't occur spontaneously. We have to make it occur by changing economic and the economic and political institutions. Then, for example, when someone asks me, as they twice asked me during the semester, what about universal basic income? I say the significance of any discrete arrangement like that depends on what it's connected with. So universal basic income means one thing if it's just part of the construction of this haven, as it has been for the most part. For example, Finland accepts universal basic income, but it's not part of some larger project to change the market economy, to change Finnish democracy. It means another thing if it's then the counterpart to this effort to arrange the storm. So that's the direction. But And if we take any particular form of human rights, we can't impose normative conditionality prematurely, because then we will prevent the main agents from engaging in the conversation and in the coalitions that we need them to be a part of. So at the outset, normative conditionality has to be minimized so that the terms of the conversation and the participation of the conversation can be rendered more general. Then, little by little, we have to construct a legal and institutional vocabulary that shows how these forms of protection of individual agency and collective agency, as in labor rights, can be separated from their conventional North Atlantic forms. So they can take a range of forms and not just that form. Just take an example I gave. So the rights of labor militancy are now commonly associated in the North Atlantic world with the collective bargaining system. But the collective bargaining system is not an ideal. It's defective for the reasons that I stated. And what we would better want to do is to combine some of its elements with elements of the corporatist regime. So automatic unionization of everyone, but complete independence of the unions from the state. That's a superior ideal. That's a superior institutional system. But it's not represented in the world. It's not part of the debate in the world. So we need to construct this larger conversation in which the argument about alternatives can go forward, rather than imposing the present defective Western variant as the condition for participation in the conversation. That's the problem. So the Chinese can say, well, we don't want Western democracy, but that then can become an excuse, a pretext for the dictatorship of engineers. So what are we going to do? We can't say, you can't participate because you're not democratic. And then they'll say, well, is the United States a real democracy? And we'll have an endless conversation about that. We have to have the conversation on the widest possible terms, and then little by little develop this vocabulary of the alternatives. And then at some point in the future begin to be able to say, these alternatives are within the range of the acceptable, and these other things are not in the range of the acceptable. So this requires an extraordinary amount of self-restraint, not just on the part of the politicians, also on the part of the prophets, if there are any. All right, so this was really the first part of the discourse about globalization that I intended to have. Now I want to narrow the focus to economic globalization. The globalization in the world economy. And to do that, I want to begin with a historical introduction, which will help clarify some of the problems and some of the options. So globalization has come twice in modern history. It came first in the period from 1870 to the First World War. And then it came for a second time, a second wave of globalization in the aftermath of the Second World War from 1946 on, and especially from 1970 on, or you could say 1971, when the United States went off gold and the reserve currency of the world, the dollar, ceased to be backed by gold. The second wave of globalization accelerated. Now, we can't say that the second wave has gone further than the first wave. It's not possible to say that. So now global capital flows in the second wave are greater than they were in the first wave, but net capital flows are actually smaller. Trade flows as a percentage of GDP of the trading countries have only recently become larger in the second wave than they were in the first wave. And migratory flows in the second wave are much, much smaller than they were in the first wave. So if we are to compare these two waves of globalization by a simple quantitative measure, we can't say that the second wave has gone further than the first. It hasn't. Now, in what respects were they similar, these two waves of globalization? In two fundamental respects. First, they both took place under the aegis of an idea of institutional convergence, of convergence to the same best institutions and practices worldwide. In the first wave, it was a loose, informal idea of convergence. Convergence to the policies and arrangements of the richest, most successful economies, like at that time Britain. And in the second wave, as I'm going to say later, a much more strongly formulated idea of convergence, backed up by economic theory and by neoliberalism, a much stronger idea of convergence. The second similarity between these two waves of globalization, is that in both waves, the idea of convergence was enforced by the discipline of capital. So in the first wave, that took the form of the gold standard. Money was based on gold. It had to be backed up by gold. And the practical effect of the gold standard, as the Polish Marxist economist Kalecki observed, was to make the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence of the asset holding classes. In other words, if there was a failure of business confidence, gold would automatically flow out of the treasuries of the countries, of the states, and then at some point there would be an absolute balance of payments constraint. So the discipline of capital enforced the idea of convergence. Now in the second wave, we have a kind of neo-gold standard. We have a functional equivalent to the gold standard. In the rich countries of the North Atlantic world, the functional equivalent to the gold standard takes the form of the resurgence of so-called sound finance doctrine, that is, restraints on Keynesianism. In the practice of the central banks, the combination of an inflation targeting regime, an emphasis on primary fiscal surplus, and a commitment to flexible exchange rates. The effect is also to establish something of the reality and the influence of what the gold standard was supposed to do, which was to tie the hands of national governments and make them depend on the award of confidence by the financial markets, domestic and international financial markets. And we have then in part of the developing world, especially in Latin America, another version of this functional equivalent of the gold standard. And that is a syndrome of policies that include acquiescence in a low level of domestic saving, both public and private, openness of the capital account to free flows of capital, dependence therefore on foreign capital as to finance national development, and an insistence on generating a primary fiscal surplus, that is a surplus disregarding the servicing of the debt, with more attention to constraints on spending than on raises of the tax take. That's the functional equivalent to the gold standard in Latin America. And I observed earlier in the course that although this present form of globalization does impose constraints on all the countries in the world, different parts of the world have responded to the same constraints in radically different ways. So the Northeast Asian economies, Japan, the tiger economies, Taiwan, South Korea, and now China, have responded in a very different way to these same constraints than Latin America. So Latin America has accepted the full syndrome of the neoliberal policies, the functional equivalent to the gold standard. The Northeast Asia has rejected them. And as I said earlier in the course, rebellion is not always rewarded, but in history, obedience is invariably punished. So Latin America has suffered the most catastrophic decline in its relative participation in world product when compared to Northeast Asia. So in the short term, the capital markets insist on respect for their religion, on obeying all the pieties of this doctrine of financial confidence. But in the medium to the long term, the only thing that counts is reality and the opportunities for gain that are generated by economic growth. So the result is that today, the greatest amount of foreign direct investment goes to the country that disobeyed all of the pieties, China, because China is where the action is. And that's the only thing that counts in the medium to the long term. So those are the similarities between the two waves of globalization. Convergence and its enforcement by the discipline of capital, with these variations that the different responses to the present system of constraints allows. Now, what are the differences? There are three main differences between the two waves of globalization. The first difference is a fundamental reorganization of the terms of the International Division of Labor. The basis of the International Division of Labor under the first wave of globalization was that advanced capital-intensive production took place in the central economies and relatively more primitive labor-intensive production in the peripheral economies. And now the terms of the International Division of Labor are being redrawn in a way that is not fully understood. So now there is a network of advanced sectors in the whole world. In India, in China, as well as in the United States, Germany, and Japan. Advanced production, the knowledge economy, is present in all the major economies of the world, rich or developing. And you could say that this network of the advanced sectors is now the commanding force in the world economy. High finance is to some extent a sideshow, even though it's capable of generating enormous waves of financial instability. That's the first difference. The second difference is a fundamental difference in the dimension of migratory flows. There's vast migration under the first wave of globalization, very limited migration under the second wave. And this has tremendous significance for the following reason. Of all the initiatives that one could imagine that would contribute to diminish inequality among nations, among states, by far the most important is any increase in labor mobility. Everything else pales in significance. So increase in labor mobility is the most fundamental way in which globalization can contribute to the diminishment of inequality among nations. Now, obviously, labor mobility cannot be imposed instantaneously or radically or suddenly in sudden moves. The question is the direction. So there would have to be compensations to the sending countries if the labor that is migrating is skilled labor, compensation for investment in the formation of human resources, and then on the part of the receiving countries, there has to be a gradualism, a spectrum, from work permits to permanent residency to citizenship, gradually. It couldn't be sudden because it would be revolutionary in the whole world. Revolution would break out in the whole world. Even in Switzerland, there would be revolution if universal flows of unlimited flows of labor were allowed to occur. But there's the question of the direction. Now, the third difference between these two waves of globalization has to do with convergence and the resistance to convergence. Now, as I said, in the first wave was an informal, loose idea of convergence. Now it's backed up. It has a canonical form. Canonical form, for example, is what we call the Washington Consensus or the augmented Washington Consensus. There's a list. People write articles, they describe it. They say it has 15 tenets and so forth. So it's canonized and it has this doctrinal form. And by the same token, the resistance to globalization is much stronger now than it was then. Then it was the protest of the so-called wounded civilizations against domination by the West, by the advanced countries. Now it takes the form of the ability of the major developing countries to imagine themselves as alternative worlds with a different future. They have the practical and spiritual resources to imagine themselves as an alternative. This potential is greatly restricted by the force of mental colonialism. And this mental colonialism affects not only the relatively unsuccessful countries like Brazil, but also the relatively successful ones like China. And it's extraordinary. I mean, you go to the Central Party School in Beijing, and they're discussing the third and fourth level works by American policy analysts and social scientists. They're not developing alternative doctrines. So, and this is a puzzling fact in the world. So in the intelligentsia in much of the world, there are two main parts of the intelligentsia. There's a neo-Marxist part, which has a kind of frozen Marxism, which has discarded the good part of Marxism, which is the transformative aspirations, and kept the bad part, the historical fatalism. And then the other part of the life of the intelligentsia in these countries is the carbon copy imitation of secondhand American-style social science and policy discourse. And that's an entirely inappropriate intellectual apparatus within which to conduct the exploration of alternatives, but that's what we have in the world. So there you have a brief account of these two waves of globalization, presented, I hope, unsentimentally, as they are, rather than as I would like them to be. Now, are there any comments about this comparison of the two waves of globalization? All right, so with that as a background, then, let me now discuss the direction of the present form of globalization, of economic globalization, in the second wave, and discuss it in a particular domain which is most illustrative, which is the domain of the Organization of World Trade. And what I want to take as the example or as the setting is, of course, not just the WTO treaties, the World Trade Organization treaties, but what is much more important, all of the practices of the multilateral trade agreements that followed, which are now much more important than the original WTO. The Trans-Pacific negotiations, the transatlantic negotiations, and so forth. And so the question is, what's the direction that the system of globalization, as illustrated by world trade, is taking in that world? Now, first is the dominant form of globalization is treating the maximization of free trade as an end in itself, a good in itself. The object is to the freest possible trade in goods and services. And as I'm going to say later, in the movement of capital. Now, this is not self-evident, because what would be the alternative? The alternative would be to say, the goal is not to maximize free trade. The goal is to maximize the possibilities for the coexistence of alternative development strategies and alternative experiences of civilization within a world economy that gradually becomes more open. That should be the goal. In other words, free trade is a means to an end. It's an accessory or secondary objective. It's not the goal in itself. Now, the second principle on which the system of world trade is developing is that things and money should acquire the greatest possible freedom to cross national frontiers as soon as possible. So free trade in goods and services should be maximized, and capital flows, freedom of capital across national frontiers. But people, the other factor of production, people, human beings, should be imprisoned in the nation state or in blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states like the European Union. So in other words, there should be a radically differential treatment of mobility of things and of money and of immobility for people. That's the basic generative principle on which the system is developing. And that too has no clear basis in either economic theory or democratic theory. Why should one factor of production be singled out for this hostile treatment? There's the practical difficulty, which I mentioned, that we could not institute labor mobility all of a sudden or in some single way. But what we could do is say things, money, and people will acquire freedom together in small cumulative steps. That would be the alternative. Instead, we've done it this other way of creating this radical contrast with the results that I began to mention before. Now, there's a possible fourth principle that one could mention, which is the world economy should be based on free labor rather than some other kind of labor. And that introduces us to the question, well, what is free labor? A question that we debated earlier in the course. Because does free labor mean only exclusion of slavery and economically dependent or economically coerced wage labor? Or should the world economy be signal in the direction of institutional innovations that would allow us to allow the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, to be reconciled with the imperatives of economy of scale? Now, I actually haven't mentioned yet the most important architectural principle of the dominant form of globalization. And that's what I want to call institutional maximalism. So the regime of world trade is oriented according to the principle, and this would be the fourth principle. I should actually have put it second. So I would say the first is that free trade is the goal versus the idea that free trade is accessory. The second is institutional maximalism versus minimalism. The third is treating things and goods as free to roam the world, but labor is imprisoned in the nation state. And the fourth is this freedom of work as the basis of the global system. So what is the second principle? The second principle is to say the world trading system will be organized to require the trading countries not just to subscribe to the market economy in the abstract, but to subscribe to a very particular version of the market economy. A version that will prohibit the trading countries from allowing any form of strategic partnership between governments and firms. So the trading system should, for example, outlaw, under the label subsidies, all the forms of partnership between governments and businesses that the countries that are now rich used to become rich, but that they want to deny to the latecomers. Or to take another example, the trading countries, the regime of world trade should incorporate the rules of the odious regime of intellectual property that was developed only at the end of the 19th century, the patent regime, that leaves many of the technological innovations of greatest significance to humanity in the grip of a handful of private multinational businesses. So this is why I'm calling it institutional maximalism. So it's a maximalist, expansive view of the idea of the market and saying, to trade, you have to subscribe not just to the abstract idea of the market, but to this very particular version of the market that doesn't allow for subsidies, that requires you to respect intellectual property, and so on and so forth. Now, this is not necessary. And the proof that it is not necessary is that the regime of the WTO and of the multilateral trade pacts followed the earlier regime of the GATT, of the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, which was based on the opposite principle of institutional minimalism. The principle of the GATT was the maximum of freedom to trade with the minimum of restraint on the institutional innovations that the countries might want to undertake for the sake of their development. And I think what's especially important to understand is that this minimalist option of the GATT, contrasting with the maximalist option of the WTO, simply followed on the long history of the law merchant in early modern history. The law merchant was the law of international trade. And the law merchant then allowed countries with radically different systems of commercial law and radically different economic practices to trade with one another. So it superimposed on the underlying legal differences a higher level of the law of international trade, which translated these differences in the underlying law into similarities in the law of international transactions. So, for example, if the Hanseatic League on the Baltic Sea traded with the Russian Empire, they were organizing trade among countries with radically different political realities and legal systems. And indeed, part of the premise of the attraction of the trade was that they were so different. Because if they weren't so different, why would trade be so useful economically or so profitable? Precisely because they were different. So the task of the law was then to allow difference, legal difference, not to stand in the way of commercial exchange. That's what it did. And that's what institutional minimalism seeks to do. Now, the economists now work with the concept of transactions costs. So for them, any legal disharmony, any contradiction in the underlying law is an economic embarrassment. But of course, if you followed that argument to its conclusion, why wouldn't it be better not to have just one state, a world state? After all, the existence of sovereign states in the world, from the standpoint of the pure logic of transactions costs, is just an embarrassment or a burden. Just have one state, one jurisdiction, one law. Then you'll simplify the problem and there'll be no transactions costs. But aside from all the other political or moral reasons for the diversity of states, there's also the reason of economic diversity. As the fecundity of a method of competitive selection depends in part on the richness of the diverse material from which the mechanism of competitive selection selects. So you can't render absolute this idea of transactions costs, because then you'll undermine the basis that makes exchange trade among the different useful. So that's the other argument. So there you have it. I've described now the dominant direction and an alternative to it. And so that's the basis then for conflict within the nation states that would have these strong national projects about which of these directions or which other direction they would follow. And now let me say one more word about how I understand these conflicts in the system, in the global system, and their relation to the conflict over national alternatives. So what I'm imagining is there's a strong national project. The strong national project can begin its early development under the present constraints of the system, like this system of global trade, that I just described and criticized. But in order to develop further, it then has to break through those limits. It has to change the system of global trade. So the countries with strong national projects, like the BRIC countries, would ally and force a change in the regime of global trade. And then once the change was made, then they could develop further in their direction. That would be the dialectic. The initial step has to come from below in the existence of strong national projects. That's the dialectic that I'm imagining. And it's in relation to that point that I now want to explain the idea of my sometime co-teacher, Danny Roderick, in the course in political economy, his so-called trilemma of globalization. And here's Roderick's basic idea. So if you take three things, what he calls hyperglobalization, national sovereignty expressed in distinct economic policies and distinct economic institutions, and democratic politics, you can't have all three of them. That's Roderick's claim. You can only have two of the three. They conflict with each other. So you could have hyperglobalization and national sovereignty so long as you have the golden straitjacket. The golden straitjacket is the gold standard in the earlier wave of globalization, or its functional equivalent today, what I call the neo-gold standard. You can have hyperglobalization and democratic politics if you have world federalism or a democratic world state. And national sovereignty you can combine with democratic politics, but not with hyperglobalization, under the so-called Bretton Woods Compromise, which was Keynes's compromise. So you would have restrictions on capital flows, and you would have the institutional minimalism of the GATT, but you wouldn't have hyperglobalization. Now, here's the first thing I want to say about this, and I think it helps us connect this argument with the arguments earlier in the course. Hyperglobalization cannot mean that there's no disharmony among national economic policies and national institutions. In other words, no transaction costs, no divergence. Hyperglobalization can only mean a tendency, right? A tendency towards convergence. And if hyperglobalization means a tendency to convergence, and if national sovereignty means a state with few strong national projects, defining, now what do I mean by strong national projects? I mean projects that involve massive mobilization of human, economic, financial resources to develop a country, with a broad base engaging the whole population, and with strong institutional expressions, original institutional expressions. You could translate this into the discourse of growth miracles. So in the elite, there's a counter-elite that forms, that combines productivism with nationalism, and that appeals beyond the elite to the majority below. Now the majority is the subjective petty bourgeoisie that I've described. So that's a strong national project. But what we have in the world are the absence of that, for the most part, weak national projects without those characteristics. And then democratic politics can be the high-energy democracy that I argued for, or the weak democracies that we in fact have. Now, if by hyperglobalization we mean not the extreme idealized form of total convergence, but this tendency, if by national sovereignty we mean sovereign states without these strong national projects, and if by democratic politics we mean the actual weak democracies that exist today or the authoritarian alternatives to them, then these three elements cannot be incompatible because they now coexist. That's the reality of the world. That's what we have. So then what the trilemma describes as impossible is what we actually have in the world. Now, suppose we then change the terms, each of the terms of the trilemma. And we say here, national sovereignty means strong national projects. In other words, massive mobilization of resources. We can think of it as a war economy without a war. Involving a large part of the population with clearly marked institutional expressions, or we can think of it as the growth miracles. There's a productivist and nationalist counter-elite, and it appeals to the majority below. And for democracy, we have strong democracy, the high-energy democracies, a high level of hot institutional politics, high-temperature politics, acceleration of politics, rapid break of impasse, combination of strong central initiative with radical devolution. That's high-energy democracy. If we had strong national projects and high-energy democracy, the present form of globalization, the present direction of globalization would be overthrown because it's incompatible with that. And then we would have globalization in the form of institutional minimalism. In other words, the maximum of economic openness with the minimum of institutional restraints on the ability of the trading states or of the countries of the world to reshape their own economic institutions. That would be institutional minimalism. And then the trilemma would also not apply. So in other words, the trilemma doesn't describe the present situation in the world because what it is stating to be impossible is what we actually have. But if we change each of the terms of national sovereignty and democratic politics, and therefore we change also the nature of globalization, because globalization is based on institutional minimalism rather than on institutional maximalism, then the trilemma also doesn't apply. So it doesn't apply either in its present form or in its altered form, and the trilemma is therefore false. That's the argument against the trilemma. But it nevertheless describes a tendency, the tendency of what you could call tension among these elements. So what it's saying is that if democracy becomes more democratic, or if national sovereignty takes more and more the form of these strong national projects, then they conflict with this maximalist globalization. That's the practical residue, the practical meaning of the trilemma. Now, I've actually said everything that I want to say, and even a lot more. So I think this is a good place to stop and ask for your comments. So I think it's a very interesting discussion. It's another discussion that we haven't had in the world yet, which shows that I think one of the features that draw your attention to is that by taking a position that is, I emphasize, realist position, as I said at the beginning of the class, the only thing that works is cooperative action among the sovereign states. We don't diminish the intellectual complication, we increase it. And we discover a debate which is unfamiliar, and yet of vital practical importance. So let's begin just with the last thing I said about the trilemma. Do you understand my point about the trilemma? What Roderick was trying to say, but how I think we have to reinterpret the message of his trilemma? So he's saying there's some contradiction. Globalization, we can't have this globalization that now exists in the world if we want to have real democracy and real national sovereignty. So, but in fact, we have limited democracy and limited national sovereignty. We don't have these strong national projects. And it's because they're not strong that we can have this tendency toward hyperglobalization, which never reaches the idealized limit of actual extreme globalization. If it did, there would then be a contradiction. And if we change, if we increase the energy level of democracy, if we energize democratic politics, or if we imagine even without democracy these strong national projects, these growth miracles, then this hyperglobalization based on institutional maximalism would also be impossible. So it doesn't describe the actual situation in the world, and it doesn't describe the situation that would arise if we strengthen national sovereignty and if we energize democratic politics. Yes.
So, Professor, as I understood, at the beginning of the class, you were to propose the alternatives to the economy or the globalization as we understand
Yes.
or have it today. And then this is the spectrum in which, on these two spectrums, if we see, the high energy democracy and the three elements. So what lies in between, and the tendency, is that the alternative that you were suggesting, or it's none of the?
What do you mean? So I'm saying, the arguments that I made during the semester could be understood, many of them, as arguments for reshaping the character of democracy in the direction of high energy democracy, and reshaping these national projects so the national projects become strong national projects. I just said what I mean by strong national projects. They're mobilization, they involve the whole population, and they take strong institutional expression. Those forces of strong national projects and of high energy democracy are incompatible with this maximalist globalization that we have, and that I just illustrated by the direction that the post-WTO world trading regime is taking. So that regime, if we imagine it idealized, continuing in its tendency, depends on the restriction of these strong national projects and on the damping down of democracy. And then we have this idea that there's a system that's being organized by the asset holding classes in the world and by the international technocracy. And it wants to impose a surrender to the market order, not just the abstract market order, but this very particular order. And that's incompatible with either democracy or strong national projects. So it would require, as I say, the overthrow of this regime of globalization and its substitution by another idea of globalization. So it's not that it would be more or less globalized. It might actually make possible over time a great deal more material and intangible exchange among the peoples of the world. What we now have in the world is a situation in which all of the friends of democracy and of strong national sovereignty have to be enemies of economic globalization. Because if economic globalization has this maximalist character, it's anti-democratic, it's anti-national, and the suggestion here is that we could have actually more exchange that way. Now, everywhere this is difficult to think about, and I'll give you now a technical expression of this. In the literature of globalization, there are two ways to describe or to measure the level of commercial globalization of trade. The new nomenclature is a barriers to trade nomenclature. The barriers to trade nomenclature builds the idea of institutional maximalism into the analytic descriptive categories. So it says you have more globalization if you have fewer barriers to trade. But the barriers to trade include underlying divergence in the legal arrangements of the market. The other nomenclature, which is the traditional nomenclature, is more neutral. It's the level of trade flows nomenclature. And the level of trade flows nomenclature doesn't build in to its taxonomy the description of this institutional maximalism. So the first nomenclature produces this circularity in which we not only accept the maximalist idea, but we build it into our analytic and accounting categories. And that then produces this circularity. So once you have a different idea, then that idea has to penetrate all the instruments of the analysis. Now we haven't spoken so another part of economic globalization is the monetary arrangements of the world. And in the monetary arrangements, the fundamental factor is that the world has a reserve currency, which is the United States dollar, with the effect that all of the countries in the world, to the extent that they depend on the dollar as an instrument for their trade, then also become dependent on United States monetary policy, and indirectly then on United States fiscal policy. So the BRICS countries, for example, have an interest in overturning the dependence on the dollar. And the American politicians and technocrats want to preserve the hegemony of the dollar for as long as possible. It's not clear why this is in the U.S. interest. The United States gains certain benefits from the acceptance of its currency as the world currency, but it's also a source of a great deal of complication and conflict. In any event, the BRICS countries have started to develop mechanisms to trade among themselves without depending on the dollar. So there's a long process of the substitution of the dollar as the international currency. But so these issues they're complicated, they're technical, and of course we have this problem in the world that to discuss problems like this, we need to be technicians and visionaries at the same time. And as you know, that's a difficult combination. Any other comment? Yes.
Wondering how you feel about the development of a synthetic global reserve currency. That's something that I've seen.
Well, there are many proposals, right? To have a basket of currencies, to have the drawing rights of the IMF were have been proposed from time to time as a model for what I suppose you're calling a synthetic currency. Synthetic currency could also mean this basket. So there are many proposals. So I don't think there's a technical difficulty in finding an alternative if we really want to. The Chinese were opposed to it in an early stage because China had huge US dollar reserves. It held its reserves in the form of United States dollars. So it wanted to avoid any kind of instability in the market that dealt with its main asset, which were the United States reserves. But those were the days in which China sung a very different tune from the tune it sings today. Those were the days in which the representatives of China said, we're just a poor developing country like the other developing countries. Now they, with much less compunction, adopt the discourse of the G2, and they openly propose a condominium of the world with the United States. So that comes together with a change in their attitude to questions. Yes. All right. So, yes.
I'm wondering what you think is. You mentioned the inequality in the U.S. income or economic inequality in the United States, but it's been kind of increasing within nation states across the developed world. And I was wondering how this framework connects with that.
specifically with inequality in the United States or with inequality
More broadly,
generally?
inequality more broadly.
So I mean, this question has many parts, right? But for our purposes here in the argument of this course, one exemplary project of development in the present period of these strong national projects, of these growth miracles, is the attempt to create a knowledge economy for the many. So the logic now of production is that for this mass production, industrial mass production was the economic backdrop to institutionally conservative social democracy, right? It's never possible to overstate this. That's the significance of the relation between institutionally conservative social democracy and this particular economic arrangement. So a large stable labor force assembled in large productive units like factories under the aegis of big corporate entities. That was the concrete economic backdrop to the left-leaning political forces in these countries. That world has disappeared. So, and now we have, instead of this, for this mass production, we have this insular knowledge economy, which has learned how to separate the lucrative and creative core from the commoditized periphery. So, and it's often completely without physical apparatus. Many of these businesses are fabless. They have no physical structure. And then together with that comes precarious labor, precarious employment. So there are tremendous forces of inequality which are rooted in that economic reality. And it's hopeless to say that the way in which we're going to redress that is by the same logic of progressive taxation and redistributive social spending, tax and transfer. The structural problem has to have a structural response, a structural solution. We have to diminish the abyss between the vanguard and the rear guard, or we're not going to solve the distributive consequences. We're not going to avoid the distributive consequences. So that becomes primary. And then the question is, under what organization of the world economy is there the greatest chance that we could develop strong alternatives to that we could have projects like the project of creating a knowledge economy for the many? And what I'm saying is that this process does not begin in the cosmopolitan business and technocratic elite giving as a gift to humanity this alternative regime of, in this case, of trade. There has to be agitation below in the nation states. They have to develop these strong national projects, like the project of seeking to have a knowledge economy for the many. And they then have to discover that this project conflicts with some of the rules of this established form of globalization. Like this attempt to outlaw under the label subsidies the forms of strategic coordination between government and private business. Then they ally together and they demand a change in the arrangements of globalization. It's a political movement, short of war, but it's a conflictual movement. And then the present form of globalization is overthrown, and then you establish globalization on the basis of institutional and legal minimalism, and that allows this project of creating a knowledge economy for the many to go further. That's how I'm imagining the relation between the struggle over alternatives in the national domain and the struggle in the international domain. But we're very far from that. And one of the reasons why we're very far from that is we don't even have the ideas of it. Now, how can the thing itself happen if we can't even imagine it? And so that's why I insist on my point, which is the premise of the argument of the course, which is that ideas alone don't change the world, but without ideas we can't change it. So we have 2 more classes, and we'll go back to philosophy next week and to social theory.
No, it'll be light. Light. Disgusting. Have you?
Are you playing? You guys play on Friday? Sometimes.
Usually, but not that the last couple of times we got sick.
Yes, I'm going to Brazil in May 14th. Good, thank you.
I don't know. I would myself.
What's your name?
Is that very happy today?
What time?
Can you